Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on mobility data decentralization, leveraging Galileo and blockchain. My name is Josep Laborda. I am from Factual, and I'm also the coordinator of the European project MOLIÈRE. This is a project co-funded by the EUSPA, the European Union Agency for the Space Program. And this webinar today is also co-organized together with EIT Urban Mobility, with whom we are cooperating from MOLIÈRE to develop a paper on the challenges of mobility data on a blockchain platform and how to benefit from decentralization features. Before we start, let me give you a few instructions on how this webinar will be conducted. First of all, please, when you don't speak, mute yourself. You will always have, during the whole webinar, the possibility to interact with any of the speakers or the moderator through the chat. So feel free to interact with us through the chat. But otherwise, please remain silent. There will be, this is the agenda for today. It's quite packed agenda where we have 5 speakers. All of them, except one, are participants in the MOLIÈRE project. So the first one to be speaking today is the CEO of IOMOB, Boyd Cohen, who will be addressing the topic of the fragmentation of the mobility ecosystem and how we are dealing with this challenge in the MOLIÈRE project. He will be followed by Philip Sumner. He is a very well-known expert in the field of blockchain, and he will be explaining where, when, why, and how to use some sort of decentralization, in particular in mobility. It will be followed by Josep Sanjuas, CTO of IOMOB, who will be addressing the topic of governance and the business model in a mobility as a service platform like the one that we are building in the MOLIÈRE project. Let me say that IOMOB is the main technological partner in this project. That's the reason why they are addressing these topics in this webinar. Then it will be the turn for Elena Cristobal from Carnet, who will be letting us know about some of the most important features of Galileo sourced data, particularly in the mobility space, of course. And we'll be closing with a presentation by Benjamin Dokir from Osborne Clark on the topics related to data privacy in a blockchain environment. After each of the speakers' presentation, there will be a question launched to the audience by our moderator. You will have time to answer the question throughout the Q&A part or with the speaker, so you will have time. You can either click on the link that will be shared by the moderator on the chat, or just enter menti.com and insert the code that will be provided. So there will be 2 ways of interacting with the open question. So feel free again to launch whatever concern, question that you might have. This is meant to be an interactive session. Not a monologue from our experts, but rather a dynamic conversation through which you get to know what we're up to in this project, and you raise your concerns, your questions, or whatever you want to know. And without further delay, let me pass the floor to our moderator today, Lucas Puerta, who is our blockchain expert at Factual. Lucas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josep. Good morning to all the participants of the webinar. As Josep said, I'm Lucas Puerta from Factual, and I have been involved in many blockchain projects during the last 5 years at all levels, and especially with Josep and the Factual team as a blockchain consultant or blockchain expert, if you want. I'm so happy that I was given the opportunity to moderate this webinar, and I want to thank all the MOLIÈRE partners for that. And well, let's start with our first topic. The first topic is the challenge of fragmentation in the mobility ecosystem towards frictionless, seamless, affordable, and convenient mobility on demand. Our first expert, Voit Cohen, is going to present it. Voit is the CEO and co-founder of IOMOB, a decentralized Internet of Mobility network. Since obtaining his PhD in strategy and entrepreneurship at the University of Colorado in 2001, he spent the past 2 decades focused on accelerating the path to a low-carbon sustainability economy. These included publishing 3 books, multiple peer-reviewed articles, and starting a handful of ventures in the smart cities and sustainability arena. Welcome, Voit, and thank you for being here. Now you can share your presentation with the audience and start when you're ready, please.
Thank you. It says I don't have access to share at the moment. Oh, now I do again. Okay, great. Thanks for the intro. Thanks for the crowd. It's a small crowd, but hopefully engaged. As Giuseppe said, also hopefully we have some interaction. My presentation's maximum 15 minutes. I think I only have 5 slides. I'm actually speaking to you from Singapore, but I'm based in Barcelona. And I'm going to start my opening by asking you a question. How many of you have an app called Any Wheels? How many of you have an app called Gojek? How many of you have an app called Grab? How many of you have the LTA app? Probably none of you, unless any of you are based in Singapore or travel here frequently. I arrived a couple of days ago. Those are just some of the apps I had to download on my phone just to move around the city. So what we have in mobility on a global scale, and even in urban and regional scale, is massive fragmentation. We literally have tens of thousands of shared mobility fleets around the world, scooters, bikes, car sharing, the rest. For those of you on this webinar based in Spain, you probably are aware of the pain just traveling between Madrid and Barcelona, or Madrid and Valencia, in terms of the different services in each city. Before the COVID pandemic, there were 22 companies who were operating scooter sharing in Madrid. Of those, one of them had an app that functioned in Barcelona. And similarly, the other way around, from Barcelona, there was almost 20 companies that had a right to operate a shared scooter service, shared motorcycle and motor scooter services. And most of them were not in both cities either. So we have a lot of fragmentation in the private shared mobility fleets. Then we have tens of thousands of public transit services with their own apps around the world, and rail operators with their own apps. We have private ride-hailing operators, each with their own apps around the world. And we have 1.5 billion privately owned cars around the world. As of today, all of these vehicles are disconnected from each other. All of the companies and the public entities all want to have a walled garden, either walled garden with one mobility service, like here's my taxi app and that's it. We're starting to see some experimentation where companies like Free Now add one extra service, like a scooter service, to their app. Or we're seeing some examples where cities or private actors are creating an aggregated mobility experience, but for one city. So what we call like an urban walled garden. Like, I don't know, some of you on this call are familiar with Moss apps like Yelby, which is a nice app built by Trafi for BVG, the transit agency in Berlin. Great. You have that app that helps you move around and access a range of services, not just one. Fine. When you leave the borders of Berlin and you go to Munich, or I was just in Cologne on my way here because I had to fly through Cologne, take a train to Frankfurt and fly out of Frankfurt. All those were separate apps. Everything is a separate app. Even when they try to create a seamless experience, it's still separate apps that are fragmented around the world, separate apps in different cities with one service or a handful of services. This disconnectivity between public, private, and shared mobility creates a lot of problems. First and foremost, it drives people to just look for the easiest solution, which is their car keys, and take their car to go from door to door because they know where their car is. They don't have to open a bunch of apps for it, and they know more or less where they can park. We all know what the problems that cause regarding congestion, air contamination, impacts on quality of life, and all the rest of it. Everybody on this call aspires to be part of the solution to more seamless mobility so that people can use shared and sustainable modes of mobility and connect them, because in the end, depends on the city, but research shows in Europe, I think something like 70% of daily trips involve more than one mode. And I don't know if it's pan-European or in some of the key markets. So if you need to use more than one mode, but you have to, each time you need a mode, you need to pull out an app. And let's go back to that Madrid example for a minute. 22 micromobile scooter sharing operators were live in Madrid before the pandemic. Okay. Let's say I know the mode I want is a shared scooter. Great. I open the door to my office building to find the nearest shared scooter, and I don't see one on my street. What is my solution? Open up 22 apps to find what the nearest one is? Like, that's insane. Let alone to combine it with something else like public transit or rail or whatever might make sense for a door-to-door journey. And let's say you have that pain point in Madrid and you get on the AVE and you go to Barcelona or Valencia or wherever. Guess what? You have the same problem again, because you get to that city and none of the apps on your phone are even useful in that city. So you got to start over and download new apps and try to figure out how to combine the different services. So this fragmentation problem has a detrimental impact on quality of life, on seamless mobility for people. You know what else it does? We're embracing at IAMOB something that's called regenerative crypto economics. And that's around how you can leverage crypto token economics and Web3 decentralization business models to have a positive impact on society and the planet. One thing we don't think enough about, I think, in this discussion around seamless mobility is things like Juanita. Juanita owns a 10 vehicle taxi fleet in Berlin. All right. Juanita doesn't have the money or the use case for deploying her own app. She has 10 cars in her fleet and whatever, 8, 15 drivers, whatever it is. She relies on people discovering the taxis when they're in a taxi stop or something like that. Now, you travel to Berlin, and if you don't live there and you don't know what the local apps, you probably just pull out the Uber app. In a fragmented Web 2 walled garden world, you pull out Uber because you're used to it. All right, well, you pull out Uber and, oh yeah, okay, fine, they operate in Berlin, great. The nearest driver is 15 minutes away. It seems like a long time, but oh well, I'll wait. Keep in mind, Uber is increasing their prices quite a bit lately as well. So there's a negative impact on the consumer as far as the price right now. But forget that for a minute. What if Juanita has a taxi 1 block from you in Berlin? How do you discover it? You don't see it. It's not in your Uber app. So if we can democratize and create a sort of permissionless mobility network where any supplier, a startup, a small operator can connect to an open network effect, an open mobility network, we can create more inclusive economic opportunities for smaller entrepreneurs who deserve better access and exposure to their services. But not only that, that user, you in Berlin, you no longer have to wait 15 minutes for Uber to show up and charge you 40% more than Juanita's going to. You can actually take her taxi, which is a block away. So you wait 1 minute instead of 15 minutes. And also, guess what? That 14 minutes would have contributed a congestion from that driver coming all the way to you. That's no longer going to be contributing to this negative impact of the city. So when you think about this holistically, you can tackle so many pain points by creating an open mobility network where any supplier can connect and any demand partner can connect to make it easy for users to seamlessly move around the world. And that's what we've been building. You're going to hear more about this from Josep, so I won't go into too much depth. But we've built out this capability and we've tested it already in the MOLIÈRE project with our own modal APIs that allow us to rapidly ingest the APIs of existing fleets. We have our own journey planner that does door-to-door, intercity and intra-city journey planning to help people combine modes. And we have an API and an SDK and a white label app. And we've deployed that with MOLIÈRE branding and everything with the Galileo satellite data providing better micromobility vehicle location data. That's what we've already tested in the MOLIÈRE project. Over time, we will be supporting new forms of payment like crypto payments for users who want to do that. And we'll be decentralizing nodes, which Josep will talk about, so I won't go into that, so that other actors can deploy our architecture around the world and sort of localize and regionalize the architecture, but all the while making it interoperable. That leads me to something else I think is really interesting, is when you think about what can be enabled by this kind of open mobility network and what kinds of services could be offered. So what we're offering today is what a lot of people would consider MOS in terms of seamless multimodal mobility. We just don't have boundaries on it. It's interoperable and can cross cities. But we're going to be adding other things like EV charging, and that includes public EV charging networks, privately owned ones, and shared ones. So basically an open network effect of all of the charging stations that are open to being connected to address range anxiety more directly. We also aim to support peer-to-peer car sharing, so you could post your private car to the Internet of Mobility. If you remember that first slide, 1.5 billion privately owned vehicles, let's make them part of the global mobility ecosystem for owners of cars who are less bound to, oh, I have to own and drive my car all myself. And before you think no one would do this, there's 2 unicorns in the world that just do this already. So massive companies that already support peer-to-peer car sharing. And you might remember that 10, 15 years ago, no one thought anyone would rent out a room or their house to somebody they never met, but look at what Airbnb did. And finally, when you think about like an open mobility network, you think about what else could it be used for? Why not last mile logistics? If you're a last mile logistics company, you or your drivers don't have to own every possible vehicle that might make sense for any type of delivery that would happen in a city. You could tap into an open mobility network. And if all you need is a scooter to take Chinese food 3 blocks away, then you offer a scooter to the driver. If they need to take a box of books that's very heavy, then you offer them a car share on demand for 1 hour. I talked about, I'm wrapping up, by the way. I talked about regenerative crypto economics. This is some research we did maybe a year ago with impact investors to say, all right, if the world would embrace and adopt a mobility network approach where any service can be connected, any demand partner can access it, and any user can seamlessly move between places door to door, accessing a range of vehicles without this fragmentation problem, how many emissions could we remove from the world on an annual basis? At scale, if this type of technology was rolled out globally, we could reach over 1.3 billion tons of reduced emissions, which is a lot. It's more than 2% of total global annual emissions. So with that, I will wrap it up and take any questions.
And now I would ask to the audience if they have some questions for Voigt, please. You can jump in directly, or you can share your questions via the chat if you want, if you prefer.
Looks like there's an optimistic community. Probably has nothing to do with my talk, but they're here because they believe in the potential.
Okay. No one asking. Okay, Void, I have a question for you. Okay. What are the barriers, the main barriers to convincing the mobility ecosystem to expose their APIs?
I mean, I think obviously it depends on if who the actor is and how big they are. You know, the larger the actor, the more investment they have, and the more private they are. So if they're venture capital backed, the largest players, they want to continue to own the customer. And their concern about participating in these more open aggregated models is that they lose ownership of the customer and the customer data. And that's, you know, gold for these big companies. So I would say for those companies, that's the biggest barrier, is getting them to embrace the opportunity of being part of an open network. And what we discover with them is that, you know, I think post-COVID, we found a lot less resistance than before COVID. All these companies are trying to find ways to become more profitable. And by being part of these networks, they can optimize the utility of their fleet. And the way our model works at IAMOB is that we don't go B2C. So we don't sell this direct to end users like, say, Moss Global with their WIM-app, but instead we work with major rail operators, airlines, and other organizations who have millions of users. Those users are appealing to the big players who would like to have access to those journeys. And sometimes users would not know about them, even if they're a big player, because that big player doesn't operate in the city where that person lives, and they haven't discovered or downloaded that app. So it's like zero cost customer acquisition and fleet optimization. And we're finding increasingly that even the biggest players are less resistant than before. So I think it's starting to become a lot easier for us to get APIs from the big players. I mean, there's a growing interest in creating a library and getting private actors willing to just open their full API for deep integration. But unless that becomes legally required, I think it's going to be a while before we see that voluntarily happening.
Is a mass governance and business model how to orchestrate mobility and make it robust, secure, and financially viable in a decentralized approach. And Josep Sanjuas is going to be the next expert presenting. He's the CTO and co-founder of IAMOB. He received a PhD in computer science from the UPC Barcelona Tech in 2012 and co-founded and led the UPC spin-off Talaya Networks, later acquired by Auvic in 2018. At IAMOB, Josep channels his passion for decentralization and blockchain technology into building the Internet of Mobility, a global decentralized mobility network. Thank you for being here, Josep, and welcome. You can share your screen when you're ready and start presenting, please.
Hi, it's my pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to share my presentation. Hopefully you can now see it in full screen. So yes, I'm going to talk about decentralized mobility as a service, governance, and the economic incentives behind it. It's not a very long presentation, so please do use the questions time to ask away. What I'm going to do first is set a vision of what we mean by decentralized mobility as a service in the MOLIÈRE project, which also maps very well to what we are building at IAMOB as the Internet of Mobility. So there's lots of things that decentralized mobility as a service could mean, and I'm going to set a vision of what we mean in this project. So it's basically anchored around two main principles. One is decentralized mobility as a service has to be globally interoperable as an infrastructure, so that, as Boyd said before, the same user interfaces you use in one city or in one country or in one continent have to also work in another continent. The only way this can be achieved is if this infrastructure is built with an interoperable approach, so that the APIs and infrastructure that is used for by a user interface to connect to a mobility service in one city or in one area of the world also works in another area of the world with the same user interface. The other main principle, and this is where the decentralized concept is crystallized, is we want this infrastructure to be neutral and not under the control of one single organization. So what that means is that any element of the infrastructure can be operated by any stakeholder and not in exclusivity. So if you compare it to a traditional, what's usually called Web 2.0 model, the infrastructure is under the control of one single company, which has, of course, its own incentives and profit-seeking desire. And this introduces significant platform risks for all the involved stakeholders. So imagine a centralized mobility as a service platform that is global and is reaching a critical mass, and it's operating at a big scale. Then what happens is that the company behind this platform can take unilateral decisions to raise, say, transaction fees, to veto mobility services, or to favor mobility service in which the company has a financial stake. So this introduces all these platform risks for both for the mobility services that participate in this network, but also for the user interfaces or the apps that are connected to this platform, because they are subject to the whims of this centralized company that has a complete hold over how the platform operates. So that's why we value that the mobility as a service infrastructure has to be decentralized, has to be neutral, and not under the control of one single organization that can push its desires on the whole ecosystem. So what are some challenges in building a decentralized mobility as a service infrastructure? Well, we want to maintain global interoperability, right? As I said before, the same application to access mobility services has to work in any country, in any city, in any continent. And this is achieved via standard APIs. But even though the network has to be globally interoperable, it also needs to consider local particularities. In particular, this can be regulations, laws about what can and cannot be done in each area, whether it's about mobility services themselves or data processing. The other challenge is to build this network in a way that every stakeholder stays economically motivated to perform its job and to, I will add, join the network in the first place. So aligning the incentives for the broader good of the ecosystem is an issue. So who are these main stakeholders in decentralized mobility as a service? So of course we have mobility service providers. These are the players that basically offer mobility services in this decentralized mobility as a service infrastructure, which you can see in the end as a kind of mobility marketplace, right? So mobility services can be offered and they can be purchased by end users. So the end users connect to these mobility services through this mobility as a service infrastructure via what we call demand partners. And demand partners are basically any kind of company organization operating a user interface that facilitates access to these mobility service providers. So this can be, usually they are mobile apps, but they could also be, say, any kind of web interface where, for example, nowadays you can buy airline tickets and also purchase, say, for example, a car rental. So this would also be a demand partner in this framework. And then there's finally the MaaS platform, which connects all these players together to create what's the glue that holds the ecosystem together. So the way we can have a global infrastructure with shared mobility, with shared aligned incentives, such that the ecosystem is bound together, while still being able to adapt this network to the specificities of each area in the world, is to split the infrastructure into layers. So we have the mobility layer, which is where the mobility services are exchanged. They are offered and discovered and purchased by end users. The mobility service providers and the demand partners can use unified data format and API specifications to access any of the local deployments, so that this application that is built, say, for example, in Barcelona, also works in Singapore by being able to locate what is the local deployment of each city as decided in the governance layer. So basically the governance layer is a layer where decisions are taken, and one of the key decisions, as we will discuss later, apologies, is to decide what are the local deployments and how they are operated. So the mobility service providers and the demand partners are connected to the mobility layers through these data formats and API specifications that are common to any local deployment. But the local deployments can be tailored to each region. This is how you achieve global interoperability, but also you get the ability to tailor each local deployment to each area. And they are all bound together by the governance layer. So what is the mobility layer? As I said before, the mobility layer is where the exchange of mobility services takes place. So the main features or functionality that the mobility layer offers is to enable the discovery of mobility services by end users, the combination of all these mobility services in integrated route plans to travel from A to B, and then the booking and payment of all these mobility services. As I said before, this needs the mobility layer needs to be split in regional deployments to account for local regulations or usage patterns. So as an example, we were in discussions with a big company in the UAE, and one of the requirements they set forth is the infrastructure needs to be hosted in the UAE. And many countries have their regulations. Of course, there's GDPR and all the rest that place boundaries on where the data can reside and how it can be transferred between regulatory boundaries and so on. And sometimes it's not even about regulation; it's just desires of the companies in an ecosystem for the data to stay local, or to enable certain kinds of mobility services that are particular to this area. So that's why the mobility layer needs to be tailored to these local areas, these local deployments. So at the same time, the mobility layer needs to operate with a degree of closedness, in the sense that the data about mobility patterns needs to stay private. It cannot be exposed publicly, as opposed to the governance layer, which needs to be very much public. In the governance layer, what we do is we make decisions, basically, and these decisions are made by token ownership votes, token ownership based votes. So there's players with an incentive or with an interest in helping the mobility as a service infrastructure succeed. So they own a stake of the infrastructure by owning tokens that represent this ownership. And these tokens represent not only the ownership, but also the decision power over any decisions that need to be made for the good of the infrastructure as a whole. Something we force in our design is all these governance decisions to be made by participants who have skin in the game. So participation in governance mechanisms requires locking tokens. And in the end, what we achieve is that good decisions are financially rewarded because token values go up. And the converse, if bad decisions are taken, then the value of the tokens goes down. And this is how we achieve an alignment of incentives, so that whoever participates in the governance of the infrastructure as a whole is also financially incentivized to do so in the right way. So the main decisions that are to be taken by the governance layer is to appoint the compute nodes to form local deployments, the mobility layer I said before that is split in all these local deployments. So the governance layer decides what are these local boundaries and what are the nodes that run in this local, basically the mobility marketplaces in all these local deployments. And then other maintenance activities such as upgrading the infrastructure and creating API specifications and updating them and so on. So let's talk about economic incentives. We said before that there are a few stakeholders in this infrastructure. One is mobility service providers. Mobility service providers are naturally incentivized to offer their mobility services for purchase at the right price tag. So they have, in terms of business model, no particularities, except for the fact that they need to make an investment in connecting to this decentralized infrastructure to offer their mobility services in there. So when you think about other stakeholders like demand partners, it's the same story. Like many operators of applications, or for example, in the rail industry, there's this big push to become door-to-door and stop being the companies that simply move citizens from train station to train station, but they move them from door to door. They are naturally incentivized to. I'm hearing a lot of background noise. I don't know if it would be possible to mute some participant that has the mic open. Anyways, where was I? So demand partners are incentivized also to offer integrated mobility services in their offerings, but it also is an investment for them to connect to this decentralized network, to make the investment to connect. So the theme of what I'm saying in this last few sentences is when the decentralized mobility as a service network is already big, all these financial, all these motivations to join work very well. But there's a difficulty, which is kickstarting this network effect. So at the beginning, who is going to connect to this infrastructure when there are very few demand partners? And what demand partner is going to connect to this network and make the investment to integrate it in their app if there are very few mobility services? And one of the answers we've found is to incentivize growth early on. So because we have the governance layer, which is governed by tokens, we have this mechanism, this unit of account, the token that has some value. So we don't know exactly what that value is, but there is some value, right? Because these tokens represent the decision power in this network. So what we can do is we can offer incentives in terms of tokens to the parties that are involved in delivering real mobility services. So these parties are really any stakeholder involved in this. So it can be the demand partner itself, it can be the end user, it can be the mobility service. So an example of such an incentive would be we award a number of tokens for every kilometer that the user has traveled with an enabled service that offered by the mobility as a service platform. So in the end, we compensate the cost of integrating in the infrastructure. And this is especially important to kickstart the network effect. And a side benefit of this approach is it distributes the token ownership with all the parties involved in the network. So when we have a governance layer that is token governed, we have a problem, which is, well, how do we get these tokens in the hands of participants who are interested and have a stake in the well-being of the network? So as a side benefit of offering incentives based on delivery of real mobility services is that we are also distributing tokens to those stakeholders with an interest in the network. A counterpoint to that is that when we offer incentives, economic incentives, then in a decentralized network, there will be fraud. This always happens pretty much because these networks are very open. Anyone can participate, meaning anyone can come up with ways to cheat the system and try to extract these economic incentives via fraud. So an example of this would be somebody setting up an existing mobility service in some area and then pretending there is an application running in this area and reporting fake usage of this application, right? So this is why we've come up with an approach we call proof of mobility service, which is these mechanisms we have designed to prevent fraud. The aim of this is not really to prove definitively mathematically that a mobility service was delivered, because this is very hard, but to make it impractical to cheat. So to have sufficient mechanisms to prevent this kind of cheating. One of the ways we are testing this is introducing verification of services via neutral third-party companies or organizations that can verify whether, or help us verify whether a mobility service really took place. In the MOLIÈRE project, we're working on verifying that mobility services reported by a car sharing fleet really happened by deploying sensors in the vehicles that are created, operated, and installed by a third-party service that collects information on the usage of all these mobility services. So with this, I will finish, and please ask any questions that you might have.
Hello.
Hello, I hear you.
Excuse me. Oh, thank you. So excuse me, sir. It's been a great interpretation of the technical issues here. So I have recently encountered one question about some of the enterprises felt a little bit hesitant to open up their APIs. Will there be any ethnic related concerns for this kind of behavior, or maybe your project can help solve that problem? And that will be all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think, I mean, there's many ways in which opening up APIs can be incentivized. One of them is even regulation. I think in Europe there are some initiatives to try to encourage all the mobility service providers to open up APIs so that the fragmentation problem is ameliorated. But more generally, I think what works best is the carrot better than the stick. So what we're trying to do is setting up, first of all, a standard so that all these companies, they have to implement one standard to connect to a mobility service platform, mobility as a service platform, instead of each platform having its own API spec. So to simplify the problem, then we are adding all these token incentives for these companies to want to join. So hopefully this offsets the cost of this integration. And another way in which this can be tackled is these financial incentives might not have to go to the companies themselves that perform this integration or that open up their APIs for this infrastructure, but instead they can go to integrators. So integrators can invest in connecting these companies to the infrastructure in exchange for this token reward. So it's a win for all parties. The integrator gets paid for its job. The mobility as a service platform gets more mobility services connected, and the mobility service provider gets demand from the network without having to go through the effort of integrating the network. However, I mean, it's an easy. I don't want to oversimplify. I think it's not easy to make it happen.
Thank you for enlightening. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the question.
Well, thank you, Josep, for your presentation. I want to encourage the audience to, if they have any more questions for Josep. Meanwhile, I'm going to share the second Mentimeter. Which is, were you aware that one of the ways to improve the governance of mass is by decentralizing mobility management? You can answer by entering Mentimeter or by the link I'm going to post in the chat. Giuseppe, as anybody is asking, I'm going to ask you a question. How much effort is to build a centralized system as opposed to a centralized one? Is there the technical complexity warranted?
So I think it's much harder to build a decentralized system than a centralized one, because when you're building a decentralized system, you have to build everything that you have to build in a centralized way. I mean, in a centralized system, but also you have to worry about this property that the system cannot be in the hands of one single entity or company. So I would think it's an order of magnitude harder to achieve it. In terms of does it make sense to pay this cost? Is it something that we should be doing? I think we should, because mobility is, of course, extremely important. It's almost a human right. And the fragmentation in mobility is a huge problem, as Boyd explained in the first presentation. So if we want mobility to be, quote unquote, better, to be less fragmented, to be more easily accessible, then we don't want a private company to solve the problem of mobility fragmentation, because this one company will become too powerful, right? It will be a platform that will have just too much power in terms of dictating what mobility services can appear or be connected or be accessible, or playing favorites with say, imagine a private company, a private mobility as a service was the one who achieved this big success in creating a mobility as a service platform. Then they would favor their own services over services that are maybe better for citizens, right? They would have just too much power. So I think it is very desirable for this infrastructure to be a success in a decentralized architecture as opposed to a centralized one. And this is why I think it makes sense to invest in this vision.
Thank you, Giuseppe.
Very welcome.
And another last question for you. Okay.
Sure.
Are users supposed to pay with cryptocurrencies? Isn't that a big barrier to adoption? And more generally, how practical do you think your approach is? And can it work outside the lab? Right.
I think it's a good question, because we're talking about decentralized infrastructures, tokens, the role of blockchains in this architecture. I think it's a very natural question, and the answer is every user interface connected to this infrastructure can collect payments in any way, and that, of course, includes credit card payments or any payment methods that end users are more used to. And it would be a big mistake to create a mobility as a service infrastructure that requires payment in tokens, because this is, of course, yes, it is a way too big as a barrier for the adoption of this infrastructure. So the reason why we have split the role of demand partners and stated this role very generally, demand partners is a very generic term, is that we want any kind of user interface that wants to offer mobility services to any kind of users. It can be apps that face consumers, but it could also be apps that belong to a company and they are just used by employees to move around. And the way these user interfaces pay for mobility services is very easy. It's very different, right? So a consumer-facing app probably collects from credit cards. A corporate mobility solution probably just collects from the balances of the company, not via credit card payment. So we want to very much decouple how users are paying and how the money is collected from the mobility marketplace itself. So the role of the demand partner is to receive or capture the payments for the mobility services in any way, And then, yes, it settles these payments with the mobility services over this decentralized network using tokens, cryptocurrencies, or whatever the right mechanism is for these players. And same goes for the mobility service providers. Like they can announce the service, the cost of the service is in euros, USD, whatever the currency. And then exactly how these are settled inside the mobility as a service network is decoupled from that.
Perfect, Josep. Thank you. And now we can see that 9 of you have answered the question. If you were aware that MAS can improve the governance by decentralizing mobility management, 3 of you answered yes, absolutely. 2, yes, I've really heard about it. And 4 of you were not aware at all of that. Okay, so thank you for participating. Thank you, Josep, for your intervention.
Lucas, sorry to interrupt, but I think we have another question from Patrick back in the chat.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, I see it. Yes, we have a question which is, in regards to centralized versus decentralized, will we have one validator per city or per local area? And if so, is it really decentralized? So I think the answer is, it's way more decentralized, of course, if there is more than one validator per area, because when you have one validator per city, then basically the infrastructure is run by this one validator or compute node. And then it's very traumatic to migrate away from that node to another computing node, because there is data migration requirements, there is downtime probably associated to these operations and so on. So we are very much working in the decentralization of the mobility layer, so that there is basically a private blockchain running in each local deployment, so that compute nodes can be accepted or removed more dynamically, as opposed to a situation where the local infrastructure is run by a single compute node, which introduces all these difficulties. It's hard to replace it. And then if it's hard to replace a player that is running a key part of infrastructure, then this diminishes the degree of decentralization of this infrastructure.
The next topic, we continue. The next topic on the agenda is leveraging blockchain to address mobility challenges. Where, when, why, and how to decentralize mobility management for the better. And it's going to be covered by our following expert, Philipp Sandner. He's the founder and head of the Frankfurt School Blockchain Center, FSBC. From 2018 to 2021, he was ranked among the top 30 economists by the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, a major newspaper in Germany. The expertise of Professor Sandner includes blockchain technology in general, crypto assets such as Bitcoin and Ethereum, decentralized finance, DeFi, the digital euro, tokenization of assets, and digital identity. Welcome, Philipp. Thank you for being here. And when you're ready, you can share your presentation with the audience. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks much, and also thanks for being so spontaneously. I had a little bit of a tech issue. My entire PC wanted to install a new operating system. This took a couple of minutes, but thanks for being so flexible. And Boyd basically and I now switched our presentation. Yeah, let me quickly share my screens. Can you see the slides? Does it work?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, my name is Philipp Sandner. I'm working at the Frankfurt School of Finance, which is a university in Germany, and we are focusing on blockchain and finance use cases. So I would like to add the financial perspective here, digital euro, and so on. I would also like to add the tokenization perspective to mobility. So what others have been presented is basically the core around mobility, transporting, intermodal transports, and so on. And from my perspective, I would like to contribute the financial perspective, why this is important. So what we are doing at the Frankfurt School is primarily focusing on education. We do this, for example, with conferences, with study programs, and so on and so forth. So this apparently works quite well. And I think the most interesting program we are doing is the DLT Talents program. That's basically where we are educating women, just women for the blockchain space. This works quite well. And we now have, we now get close to 1,500 applications per year. And we are then educating 300, 400 women such that they can also do a decent career in the blockchain space, right? This works very well. So let me quickly provide the context of what we are talking here from a mobility perspective when it comes to finance. So first of all, we nowadays don't just say it's blockchain, full stop, but nowadays we also know that it's basically multiple domains within the blockchain ecosystem that are growing. So that's basically digital assets or digital securities like stocks and debt instruments. Then we have the euro on blockchain discussion. It's called digital euro or stable coins, US dollar and other ones, which are very relevant for mobility use cases and so on. Then we have decentral crypto assets like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so on. That's not so relevant for the mobility domain, except one thing. Ethereum is a smart contract platform, and you could, of course, represent mobility assets, mobility tokens also on top of existing crypto platforms such as Ethereum and so on. I think this is interesting. This is also then where mobility assets could potentially meet finance. This should also be relevant for the mobility domain, maybe not at the core, but should be relevant in the future. That's basically a topic around CO2 credits on blockchain topics, how to represent CO2 credits on blockchain for the sake of CO2 compensation. That's basically very dynamically. Now, at least speaking for Germany, we see that regulation is underway and it's working quite well. We have the crypto custody license now existing for 2.5 years. We have the Digital Securities Act and we have the Fund Location Act. So on a national level in Germany, there is happening a lot. The same is, of course, true for any other country in the world. Some of them are faster, some of them are slower. Then we now have for the European area, for the EU, the so-called MiCA regulation, which has become finalized 2 weeks ago, and it now should come into force end of 2024. And the MiCA regulation is very interesting also for the mobility sector because token issuances will be regulated by it. CO2 credits on token basis are falling in the MiCA scope. And of course, decentral crypto assets, smart contract platforms like Ethereum are here, and of course also the digital euro. So where are we right now? What you see here is basically the market diffusion curve of the smartphone. So nowadays everybody is having a smartphone, so market coverage is 100%. But 15 years ago, the smartphone has not existed yet, right? It was the time when Steve Jobs announced the Apple I. Now we have more than 10 generations of iPhones and Android phones and so on, and they have been sold to dozens of countries, to billions of people, right? That's basically how market coverage of smartphones went from 0% to now 100%. Yeah, just to basically indicate the breadth of what's going on here. With blockchain technology and DLT, we are right now here. It's a little bit volatile, we know this, but we are right here in the very early beginning, and we can also expect the next super developments to hype, and hype should come back maybe next year or the year after, and at some point of time, 100% of valuable assets should be represented on blockchain systems, right? That's basically the vision which we could have. This is basically something I do not want to go into detail much because I would like to not talk too much about crypto assets, but one point I would like to highlight. The crypto domain is very dynamic, and I think mobility is also creating an intersection here, not necessarily with Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is a storage of value coin, and I would like to frame the entire tokens out there as single clusters or industries, right? There is the cluster of storage of value coins, that's Bitcoin and nothing else, right? It's basically Bitcoin as a token within the storage of value industry and nothing else. Then there is the cluster around smart contract platforms, that's Ethereum, Solana, Polkadot. That's existing infrastructure, which is strongly growing because thousands of people are pushing this and developing and coding here. This is basically the largest intersection with regard to mobility, because you can always represent mobility assets, mobility tokens on these smart contract platforms. While the storage of value cluster is a winner-takes-it-all cluster, it's just Bitcoin and nothing else. The smart contract platform cluster consists of multiple technical solutions, and market share is basically jumping upwards and downwards as with other industries as well. Some projects are gaining market share, some of them are losing market share, and basically it's a competitive game. That's relevant for the mobility industry. Then DeFi is not so relevant for the mobility industry. NFT can be relevant, but I'm not talking about all the images, the digital art narrative. I'm talking about representing assets in form of NFTs. And then there is the metaverse thing, which might be relevant to mobility, but not so much. But what you see here primarily is that all these industries within the crypto domain, they are leveling on top of each other, right? So no subsequent coming domain is basically replacing the previous domain. No, it's basically stacked on top of each other. So this also represents the growth of the crypto domain. And the most interesting point is the following: nobody would have expected DeFi back in 2016. Nobody would have expected the NFT wave to happen as it happened. And nobody would have expected the metaverse to happen. So those domains which came to us have been coming to us not as expected, right? Also unexpected. Whereas those domains where we expected some growth, you know, energy, manufacturing, mobility, and so on, these domains are also unfolding. That's why we are talking here today, but they are all unfolding in a probably slower and maybe also more sustainable way than the crypto domain. So what you can see here is that the agenda of regulators, the agenda of large-scale companies, and the agenda of associations of what should have happened, and also consultants, by the way, the agenda of what should happen when did not happen as expected, but rather things came to us, you can see it here, which were not expected, right? So what I would like to mention here is consulting companies have been dramatically wrong. This also concerns this slide here. You see here the illustration of the Bitcoin network, could also be the Ethereum network. It's a decentral structure, right? You could also call it decentral protocols. It's geographically dispersed. And you can also frame it a worldwide infrastructure of computing nodes switched together. You can define Bitcoin and Ethereum basically as worldwide networks. I think that's very important because people very often still not have really understood it. For some people, Bitcoin is the software or the computing node or the miner. That's not true. Bitcoin is the worldwide network of thousands of nodes being switched together. And Bitcoin cannot technically be stopped because it's created in a way that it's redundant. That makes it a very interesting infrastructure, the same way for Ethereum, for example, where you can put assets on top of it because these assets will be there tomorrow as well. This needs to be opposed to enterprise solutions, as you can see here on the right-hand side. So you see here, for example, a consortium of banks, a consortium where only selected parties can participate. So here, that's very interesting. You have a legal body like an association or a foundation or a company, which is responsible for orchestrating this network and the consortium, right? That's the task. And on the left-hand side, you do not have such consortiums. On the left-hand side, it's pure technology sitting on servers. On the right-hand side, you have this technology being wrapped into an organization. But concerning mobility now, I think many expectations have not been met. So also you can see here, enterprise blockchain systems have not held what they have been promised. Everybody here in the call know the projects called Hyperledger in various forms, R3 Corda and so on. But with beginning of Corona, that's 2.5, 2 point something years ago, all these enterprise blockchain systems basically have faded away and it became very silent, right? This doesn't mean that crypto alone is on the rise, but now people have learned to basically combine legacy assets like tokenized real estate, mobility assets, shares, debt instruments, securities, and so on, how to combine all these legacy assets with public blockchains in the form of Ethereum and so on. Yeah, but to be honest, the base layer of enterprise blockchain systems, I would argue, is dead and it will not come again. You see this by the numbers. You have a daily transaction volume of 80 billion day by day in the crypto networks, Ethereum and so on. This is totaling to trillions per month. Yeah, that's basically really a hell lot of money which is moved around, whereas on the right-hand side, we just have a couple of advanced prototypes after 4 to 5 years of work, after dozens of corporations all around the world have inspected this and they did not make it work, right? So what does it mean for mobility? I think it's very important. That's my personal conviction here. For mobility use cases and so on, I think it's very, very, very important to deal with Ethereum smart contract platforms and put assets there, put tokens there, and so on and so forth. You can, the governance issues which have been expressed previously is also relevant for Ethereum, because any second layer protocol you're adding on top of Ethereum needs to be governed, right? You also need to have validating nodes on top of Ethereum. That's all the same discussion, but I think creating permissioned networks like the right-hand style types of enterprise blockchain networks have failed, and there is no way to basically revive them. That's my personal conviction here. It's not very popular, this very strong opinion, but look at the numbers. That's basically what happens. So therefore, it makes sense for mobility use cases to get in touch with Ethereum and Polkadot and all kinds of other solutions, because then you can build validating structures, governing structures, and so on top of existing smart contract layers. With this, I would like to now jump to the digital euro discussion, and I would like to explain to you why I think the digital euro is very, very, very important, especially in the form of stable coins. So how is a transaction of securities working? Imagine party A would like to sell some shares, and please do the abstraction here. It could also be a mobility company selling a mobility service, right? It doesn't need to be capital market products. It could also be a service or a product offered by a mobility company. Party B will pay for it. So there will be a clearinghouse in the middle who is basically doing the entire process and orchestrating it, like the approval process. Then money goes towards the mobility company or the seller of the shares, and the service or the product or the shares is moving over to the purchasing party, right? It's a multi-step process which involves shares and money, and the delivery of services, that's the shares, is organized in a different silo IT system like the money transferal, which is handled by credit card payments or IBAN accounts and so on. So why does it matter? Because in a blockchain world, we have one and the same DLT system where you have many assets on top of it. You have money on top of it, that's a stable coin. You have shares on top of it, that could be like a service also operated by a mobility company. And then the approval process, like this kind of trading process, the reconciliation, is being done by a smart contract. So the smart contract is taking over the function of a clearinghouse. This then means that the clearinghouse function is basically replaced by a smart contract, and you can remove the clearinghouse, you can shut it down. You also don't need insurance services for the clearinghouse, and so on and so forth. And the entire process is getting much more efficient, and both in terms of time, cycle time, and also transaction costs. Where can we see this? In the DeFi space. The DeFi space is nothing else than such smart contracts doing trading of multiple assets. And now, in case you do the abstraction, you can use the same logic for handling mobility services and so on and so forth. But that's why we have to have a smart contract platform like Ethereum, because only such platforms can allow assets or things to be tokenized on top of it. And now comes the final animation here. A DLT system is one system with multiple assets, and the legacy world on the upper half is organized by multiple IT systems which are not combined with each other, such that you have to have clearing houses to basically allow trading takes place across multiple IT systems. That's basically the reason why we need stable coins. And that's why I personally do not understand why central banks are so skeptical about stable coins. And that's why the same is true for central banks or the European Central Bank. They simply partly do not understand this logic, which is understandable because the ECB is basically responsible for IT system 1. And the ECB operating the silo system for money transfer, IT system 1, is basically all it needs to do. So the ECB is not caring about what is being done with the money. The ECB doesn't care about financial services, securities, service consumption, mobility, service, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't really care what is being done with the money, because the job of the central bank is simply maintaining IT system for moving money from A to B. And that's exactly why these silo structures like central banks and banks in general partly cannot understand the trillions of stablecoins and DLT systems, because you can have smart contracts doing the settlement, whereas in today's world, clearing houses are needed for this. What I just told you is, in my mind, the crucial point why the digital euro makes sense, stablecoin makes sense, and it's also an explanation why legacy organizations are partly not understanding this, including the ECB, by the way. So why is it relevant from a geopolitical perspective? China is now having a government solution for their digital currency. It's called e-yuan, and they started with it in 2014. Their system is basically live now, and they are experimenting with hundreds of millions of people. And also there are considerations to expand this payment infrastructure to other Asian countries and also African countries, right? So China has a government solution for their digital currency. In the US, there is no such government solution for a digital dollar, but what the US is having is basically a very dynamic environment, and they also now are understanding this, and they are speeding up this development. They also have US dollar reference stablecoins with more than 150 billion transaction volume day by day. So you could argue here that there is a private solution for the digital dollar. So we can see here, there is a solution for China, and there is a solution for the US dollar, and there is no solution for the digital euro. Europe is having some advanced prototypes. The European Central Bank acts very slow and also partly going into the wrong direction, as I have explained previously. Luckily, there are some national central banks which are doing some advanced prototypes, but also the negative interest rates of money and also the high hurdles of the MiCA regulation will lead to the situation that there will no growth of euro stablecoins. So for Europe, I have to say, unfortunately, that there is no government solution and there is no private solution. And that this is basically also a problem for mobility applications, because in case you would like to include the digital euro, you can't, because it doesn't exist, right? So therefore, please keep this in mind. In case there are mobility applications coming and use cases make sense, also think about experimenting with such projects and prototypes outside the European Union. Because of this, Circle is a US company which is now launching a euro stablecoin outside Europe. So it's a stablecoin issued by a US company and also maintained by a US bank. And given the current rules of MiCA, this euro stablecoin will also primarily be used outside the European Union. And imagine this, you know, it's from a European politics perspective, it's basically pretty poor what happened here. But for us, building something, for us doing mobility use cases and other things, it can be interesting, because you just have to go to Switzerland or to the UK or to other countries outside the European Union, such that you can then more easily within the European Union in a peer-to-peer manner, use this euro stablecoin to, at least in prototypes, build something where the euro is done as a digital euro. But it's not the real digital euro. It's basically a euro surrogate coin, because it's not regulated according to the MiCA so far. It might be, but not now. But still, it's a good enough proxy to experiment with in prototypes. That's what I would like to show here. US dollar stablecoins are capturing 95% of the market, and the euro stablecoins right now are below 1%. So therefore, it's good to have Circle doing this, because then we have a euro stablecoin with which we can experiment with, even though it would, of course, be much better to have a MiCA solution there, such that such a euro stablecoin could also be used within easily the European Union, sold by banks and so on and so forth. You see here that stablecoins are on the rise. It's a phenomenon which basically picked up in trends in 2020. You see especially the orange line and other lines which are going basically vertical, right? So they are growing, and it just needs a little bit of more time until the market cap of US dollar stablecoins reaches 200 million, 300 million, 400 million, and so on. And the euro stable coins, you see it here in the market cap column, is basically way below 1 billion. It's basically tiny projects out there which work. But I think much more needs to be done here to make people understand that Europe needs to speed up here. And the workaround for us when we want to build something is using these stable coins, which you can see here, using Circle's product to at least finish the building of prototypes with the digital euro involved. You can see it here. Circle on the Block Explorer is doing some experiments here. You see this very nicely here that minting and burning is being done for this euro coin, as they have called it. Yeah, why does it make sense also from a mobility context? Now imagine there is Siemens. Siemens most probably will have difficulties using these stable coins because there is no bank in Europe offering this. But please now listen, it's very interesting. What Siemens could do is they set up a subsidiary outside the European Union, that could be in Switzerland or in the UK. And those subsidiaries then could handle stablecoin transaction in euro denomination. For example, moving money from Europe to South Africa within 10 or 20 seconds. Yeah, it would be possible. And then Siemens Germany, Siemens Switzerland would do a traditional legacy IBAN transaction, you know, like to settling money within the corporation. But for leveraging stable coins, Siemens could go outside the European Union. You could do the same with mobility use cases and simply do it as a bridge with a solution in Switzerland, for example, or in the UK. Just as an example, right, to make it very illustrative what's happening here. And in case I may, I can add 2 more mobility use cases at the end, even though the Q&A round might be then 2-3 minutes shorter. I would like to highlight that things are really moving and a lot is happening here. So what you see here is one tokenization company, which is launching in the next couple of weeks, and they will launch this car wrapped into securities such that I, as Philip, could purchase a share, a real share of this car for 18 euro. So I pay 18 euro per share, and then I would own a fraction of this share. In the future, this could also be other assets from the mobility domain. That's now a vintage car for storing value, but it could also be other assets in the future. So what happens here is basically that tokenization now picks up. We had Horizon 1, that's crypto assets, that works very nicely. Now we have first real estate objects, first real assets being tokenized, like the vintage car, real estate object art, and so on. That's basically simple assets being tokenized. You see it here in Horizon 2. And now turning towards mobility, I think it will be very interesting to have more complex business models being tokenized. For example, assets as a service business model and also pay-per-use business model. Like an example I will show in a second for a tractor, could also be ESG assets like solar panels and so on and so forth. And this is now the final example I would like to bring about. So on the left-hand side, you see how traditional business is working. So you have the manufacturer of a tractor. The manufacturer is having a bank in the background. So the manufacturer is having a loan and pays annuities to the bank. And the customer is purchasing this asset, the tractor, for 100,000 euro, and potentially also needs to have a loan with a bank to basically be able to purchase this asset. This is how the entire industry worldwide, be it in the EU or in the US, works currently. And it has worked very well so far. So no critics here. But with tokenization and moving towards pay-per-use business models, you can also see now what happens to mobility. You have the manufacturer, which is not selling the tractor again anymore, but the manufacturer is basically offering the service of the tractor towards the customer, and the customer is purchasing these pay-per-use services of the tractor. And now the bank is basically changing. The bank is having investors in the back end, and the bank is helping to operate this asset with a special company which is helping to maintain the asset, the tractor, repair it, and so on and so forth. So now it gets more clear. you have now this mobility asset, which is monitored with telemetry and sensors. You can see in the blue curve here the how much the tractor has been used. And then you see in the table below the transactions. So €2.50 because the tractor has done this, €4.80 because the tractor has done something else. So that's basically pay-per-use business models, such that accounting and delivery of service is being done on behalf of the tractor, right? And now is coming the final slide here to repeat. You have the traditional business model where a tractor is being sold, and the tractor is then owned by the customer, and it's in the balance sheet of the customer for 20 years until it's fully depreciated. So this entire tractor transaction is finalized and done after 20 years. Yeah, because then the tractor is put out of the balance sheet and it's fully depreciated. In the future, I think we are moving towards a pay-per-use model such that the tractor is doing something. For example, the tractor in the winter is putting out road grit on the street, and there is also directly an insurance involved, and selling 1 kilometer of putting road grit on the street with an insurance then costs the customer €4.50, for example, right? It's a future business model of pay-per-use. And what happens now on a higher level, more abstract level is the following, and that's interesting from a mobility perspective. You see an integration taking place for delivery of service, payment, and accounting. Yeah, so delivery of service, payment, and accounting is being integrated. And now comes the key point here. This entire transaction is finalized after the tractor has driven 1 kilometer, because then the tractor has delivered its service. Payment is automatically done for €50, and sending out an invoice, accounting in the balance sheet and so on, is also directly finalized after 1 kilometer, right? I think this is basically what is very, very, very interesting to note here, because it really changes the nature of how business is being done, business models, and so on and so forth. It has a payment influence, yes, but I think it's interesting to imagine such payment style business models when you combine them with mobility, energy, and other things. Yeah, with this, I would like to close the presentation, and hopefully I didn't took too much time.
Thank you, Philippe. There is a lot happening in the crypto space, as you told us, and thank you for sharing with us all the work you are doing at the Frankfurt School Blockchain Center. And for sure, those examples will help us, will help the audience to see where we can get in the space. So now is time for Philippe's questions and answer session. But first of all, I'm going to share with you the third Mentimeter. Philippe, please, can you stop sharing so I can? Thank you. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so how familiar are you with blockchain technology? Okay, I'm going to copy the link on the chat too.
Sorry to interrupt you, Lucas, but I believe that the Menti link is the same all the time. So that's the reason why there were already 4 answers to this Mentimeter question when you launched when you launched it. So it's only about refreshing the screen and answering the next question.
Yeah, the slide is new, Josep. The link is the same, but the slide is reset. So yeah, there were 4 answers because yes, the code is the same, but the answer is different. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so you can answer during the session. And now we have a question from Jessica. Please, Jessica, you can jump in.
Hello, heute.
Hi.
Hi. So you talked about the fintechs related to the blockchain technology, and here's my question. So what's your point of view of the, as I posted on the board, the supply chain and its future?
Yeah.
Since I realized you come from German and you're really, you share some very, very promising ideas about how blockchain changes the future of automobile. So I really want to hear from you about things like that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Danke.
that's nice. As you know, logistics, supply chain, mobility, it's huge domains, not just for Germany, you know, for entire Europe. You know, in Spain, around Barcelona, in Portugal, you know, many car companies from Germany, they have their IT departments in Portugal, for example, you know, so it's mobility, supply chain, logistics, it's a European business, right? Take Airbus, you know, Airbus is a pan-EU company, also basically in doing mobility. So what I'm saying here, I think is applicable for the entire domain of mobility and logistics and so on. So to be honest, I think a lot will change, especially you know, the processes themselves are nicely working, you know, not now, you know, with the supply chain disruption, but generally the processes are working very nicely with globalization and so on. What does not work so nicely is payment across borders, right? So there needs to be more efficiency here with payments cross borders. And here, I think it's important to discuss digital yuan from China, digital dollar, digital euro, digital Swiss franc, because it will be really adding to efficiency when payment is also part of this game, which works as efficient than the flow of goods or the flow of people, right? So I think this is basically where a lot needs to happen. That's why I also pushed the stablecoin topic, because in my mind, in case you talk about mobility use cases, at least 30% of the mobility use cases will be payment in the future, because it will be integrated, right? And in case you integrate it, it doesn't matter if you talk about mobility, supply chain, logistics, it's all the same, because you integrate the service which is happening with the payment, and you're streamlining it both in a synchronized way. That's basically my key thought here concerning mobility, supply chain and logistics. You know, in case you order something on Amazon, it works extremely well, right? So I don't know. I don't think that blockchain can improve it here. But what can be improved is things like 3D printing, right? In case you are combining payment networks and 3D printers and blockchain, you can basically pay €3 and then the 3D printer is doing something. And in case somebody is disconnecting the 3D printer from the network, then it will self-destroy itself, the 3D printer, right? So I think with blockchain technology, you could combine 3D printing towards payment. It will take 2, 3, 4 more years, but I think amazing possibilities will come out of it, affecting supply chain and logistics and also manufacturing with the 3D printing stuff. Yeah. But again, you know, it will take more time. And the business model thing with pay-per-use could also be applicable to trucks. Then it's supply chain. It's not just mobility in terms of agriculture and the tractor. It's easily applicable to trains, buses, trucks, all kinds of vehicles in logistics and supply chain, such that this kind of device is only doing something when you pay for it, right? Take an autonomous truck. The autonomous truck is driving through the entire European Union from Sweden to Portugal, transporting something forth and back, and the truck is only driving when you pay it. Yeah, so you pay the truck €4.50, then it's taking your parcel from Sweden to Portugal, right? And again, this would require the truck to be participating in payment networks, and to some degree, again, stable coins could be interesting here, right? So I think this is basically my main take here. I think mobility makes extremely much sense, supply chain, logistics also, but we should not just focus on the prime mobility use cases in itself, but we should combine how business is being done there, such that the business model and also the payment stuff is getting more relevant here.
Thank you for answering the question. Danke, meine Freunde.
Yeah, that's nice. Thanks. But maybe a last remark here. You know, you ask about the car industry. To be honest, I don't think the European industry to be prepared for the future. Be it BMW or Daimler and so on. You know, they are not thinking too much into these directions, right? There needs to be like an entire new wave of digital transformation, such that these companies are also speeding up their thoughts and their developments, right? So right now, it all feels a little bit old-fashioned.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Philip. And we have another question from Patrick. What is your take on Constellation and what is your take on XRP? Philip, please.
Yeah, I'm not, I know that it's a huge ecosystem, right? And people are like addicted by it, at least within this community. So there is something to build upon. But besides this, to be honest, I think that smart contract platforms like Ethereum have moved ahead because much more people are programming in these open networks, right? You have estimated 100 to 200,000 people doing coding of all kinds of Ethereum applications day by day. This is nothing a more closed ecosystem like XRP, Hyperledger, R3, and so on can deal with. So to be honest, I'm a little bit pessimistic here because XRP is not capable so far to really make something out of their amazing community. It's like IOTA, right? IOTA is also having an amazing community, you know, like people really being fascinated by this tech. But well, XRP works, but IOTA doesn't really work. And given the speed of development of other smart contract platforms, at some point of time, I would see people to become disappointed because IOTA not going live, and also XRP having limited functions. So therefore, I'm a little bit skeptical because they are not leveraging their amazing community. But of course, the project is still there. It's one of the largest ones out there. But I think other projects have higher potential.
There is a third question from Patrick. We are really tight on the schedule, Philip. So the question is in reference to Circle Digital Euro. I don't think there is zero transaction cost using it cross-border. The gas fees can be whatever during certain times per day. If you can really quick give an answer to Patrick, please, Philip.
I missed there was some noise in the background. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, in reference to the Circle Digital Euro, Patrick, don't think there is zero transaction cost using Ether cross-border. The gas fees can be whatever during certain times per day.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly the point why I'm very keen on these smart contract platforms. Due to the competitive pressure within the smart contract platform cluster, you also should see transaction costs to fall as time is passing, right? And you're absolutely right. You can transfer then US dollar or euro or any other mobility asset, you know, like an NFT of some kind of ticket, you know, like a ticket for mobility stuff. You can transfer it from one point on the globe to another point on the globe at zero transaction costs in close to zero transaction duration, right? This is really massive, you know, and therefore I think it makes sense to basically combine these payment ideas with delivery of service in the mobility field, because the processes in the mobility domain are partly working very nicely, and now payment, especially cross-border, can catch up here, right? And that's exactly the point. You could use Ethereum as a base layer, and you can put on top of it the euro, the dollar, the Swiss franc, or any other thing you would like to get your money with. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you for your answers. And now we can see the results of the Mentimeter. How familiar are you with blockchain technology? Okay, now we are going to continue welcoming Elena Cristobal for our fourth topic on the agenda. leveraging Galileo source data, the importance of highly accurate and reliable geolocation data. Elena is a civil engineer specialized in urban planning with over 7 years of experience in the transport and mobility industry. Recently landed in Spain after developing her career in the UK, Elena is now playing her role as an innovation project manager at Carnet Barcelona, where she's focusing on thinking and creating new solutions to help Europe drive the way towards the new mobility paradigm that societies are demanding. Welcome, Elena, again, and please, you can start presenting when ready.
Hello, everyone. I was actually sad that Philip and blockchain discussion finished, but I tried to make it as easier and smooth as possible. Let me share my screen. So yeah, as Lucas mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about the importance of highly accurate and reliable geolocation data. So all the, and excuse me, I'm going to take my headphones out. Can you still hear me? I'll take that as a yes again.
Yes.
So yeah, after all this discussion that we've been having on blockchain and mobility and how the future network can be developed, I'm going to go back to basics on how the data that we're going to be introducing in the blockchain, the data that we're going to be using for that future mobility services needs to go back. So I'm Elena, as Lucas mentioned, and I work for Carnet. This is an open hub initiated by SEAT, the Polytechnic University of Catalonia, and also Volkswagen. So our main focus is working within the automotive and mobility research and innovation field. So one of the projects that we're doing at the moment to shape that mobility paradigm that we were discussing during all this session is MOLIÈRE. So MOLIÈRE wants to create this mobility data marketplace, which is basically an open Wikipedia of mobility data. But the basis of all of it is the use of Galileo. So as all of us have listened during the session, we've been talking about data. We've been talking about how to move it around, how to use it around, and how to make it just one so that everything is decentralized and there is this integration of services. But coming back to basics again, this can't happen without Galileo. So what is Galileo? Galileo is the European satellite that is bringing a lot of benefits. Some of these slides have been given to us by the European Space Agency. So basically the benefits, I'm going to go brief because I know that we have all extended, so I'll go straight into the mobility. But the key benefits is that all the multi-frequency, the high accuracy service and the authentication services that it's providing. What it does generate is that it's providing an open service, so completely essential for that open mobility that we've been discussing, but it's also giving all this accuracy, which is reducing the error at street level resolution to less than 20 centimeters. So once we go into the accuracy, it also provides this continuity of data, which goes around and around, and it's very difficult to stop also because it's a civil service. It's not like GPS, for example. It's been open for actually for army or military purposes, and then it's been considered to the public for its use. But in this case, this is a civil service completely invented and made from the European Union. So that's one of the great things that it has. But it's also developing all these, let me go one back. It's developing all these technologies which allow for the authentication of data. So it basically prevents from spoofing. It does prevent, so it allows authentication of both the commercial service, but also all the navigation. So you can check that all the data that you're receiving is actually from the Galileo, from all the satellites that it's saying it comes from, but also it tells you that it's actually happening. So when we go into mobility and apply all these principles and all this innovation that Galileo is presenting into mobility, it does open a lot of doors to all this innovation and all these future services that MOLIÈRE is actually studying at the moment. So as I was previously saying, the first thing of this is that public ownership means public priority. I was saying earlier, all this is civil, so there shouldn't be a reason for interruption of data. There shouldn't be a reason why the European Union would not want to share all the data that it's taken within, of course, the regulations and the law that our colleagues are talking about later on. But it's clear that there can't be a mobility data marketplace without being an open source of data, which is public, for the public, to the public. So that's the first step that we need to consider. And actually, in this situation, that really dramatic situation that we are living out at the moment between Russia and all the other countries that are involved in all this, and I won't come into this topic, but what could happen if this was not a public or a civil service is that at some point the military, or because of army or war purposes, the service could stop. So at the moment, everyone is kind of working on GPS. You've got your Google Maps, you've got a lot of things, and there are people who are already using all the Galileo and other sources of data, other satellites. But if right now USA stops all this, it would be catastrophic. So the first point of Galileo and going into the Galileo's data, starting using it because it's the European one, it's also because you are actually ensuring that there is this continuity of service and it's just for public use. So also regarding all the mobility of the service, the public transport, the demand responsive transport, all the services and solutions that are going into the market at the moment, because now people are starting being tired of all the things that the excessive use, not the use, but the excessive use of private single car occupancy trips are actually going into, or the way that it's actually impacting the way we live and the way that we move, is that we need to provide effective shared transport services. And without Galileo and all these accuracy and the high accuracy service that it's at the moment investigating and that it's coming to a reality, there couldn't be this. We were talking previously with our IMF partners about how people want to go out and know where the cycle is, or how people want to go out and get a cab and know exactly how fast it's going to come, or all this real-time information. It couldn't happen at the moment. We've all gone through this experience of going on Google Maps on your phone and suddenly thinking that you're in one place, and it happens that the phone says, well, actually you're in the middle of a building where that's not true. So with Galileo's use, these would go down, and that way you could locate every single fleet of this biking sharing system, or where is the service that you want to actually going to use, how much or how long you're actually going to be taken, or how long you need to wait for the next bus to take place. Those are all solutions that actually exist, but they don't really deliver what they promised, in that there is this lack of accuracy that is actually meaning that some people are not willing to change or shift towards those sustainable modes. Then we go, of course, into the autonomous vehicles. How are we going to be developing a solution or a technology that is going to be driving you safely if we don't know where we are, and there is not that completely reliable communication between vehicles, if there is not that completely optimization of the infrastructure? So again, Galileo, on those 20 centimeters of error that they are going to be delivering in the near future on the at the street level, reducing all the interferences, reducing all the multipath errors that are normal to this type of technologies. Without that, there is no way that all the autonomous vehicle solutions can come into the market, and not just come into the market, but be used by people. If people don't rely on this, if people don't have that safety perception, there is no way that something is going to be commercialized and something is going to deliver all the benefits that actually can do. So of course, without the data, and this is I would say that it's pretty obvious, but it's actually something that we need to remember, because sometimes we are working too much on new solutions and new things, and there is no real need to reinvent the wheel. So let's go back to the beginning. There can't be mobility, any kind of policies, but in this case, in the case that we're talking about today, there can't be mobility decision making without data that it's actually accurate, that it's continuous, that it tells you what people start, not people but users, respecting all the information, respecting all the data, and respecting all that privacy, but still being open. If you don't know that people are moving one way, if you don't know the demands that you're having, if you don't know whether people are going faster than they should, or if you don't know that there are parking issues, if they don't know what's the bus route that it's actually taking longer, if you don't, all those type of things, you can't make any decisions. You can't work your city around the existing problems. Could we do something with the data that we already have? Well, probably no, because if we could, we would have done it already. So the reality in here is that the solution that MOLIÈRE is proposing with Galileo, but also the blockchain technology that our colleagues have been explaining earlier, will allow all this decentralization of data, will allow all this integrity and integration of mobility service providers and users and applications, so that everything works for everyone. And then authorities and the people on consultation can take or can make their decisions knowing exactly what the needs are and what the problems are exactly. Then we go back into payment. Of course, our colleague Philip has explained all this a lot already, but again, whereas we are having this layer of security in the blockchain solution, Galileo is also providing at a different level this authentication and encryption of data, which allows you to get that that certainty that the trip has taken place, that the user who's actually claiming to have done the trip has done it, that the service provider who's actually claiming to have provided service has that is for real, and it also gives you that ability to cross-check that the mobility service provider and the user's data align. This is within seconds, because again, you don't need a lot of close nodes to have all this. This is one of the things that Galileo is promising. It's global, so it doesn't really matter whether you're in Singapore or whether you're in Barcelona, here where we are today, or it doesn't really matter where you are. Galileo is global, and it allows you for this, or it will. They are in the developing stage at the moment, like very close future, but within the MOLIÈRE field, it will allow you to make all this data so that all the financial thing, or the financial side of the mobility systems do work under safe circumstances, not just because of the blockchain solution, but also at a very, very basic an initial level, which is like the collection of data. So of course, there are cases that have already been using Galileo. Some of them are not in a mobility industry, but for example, all this technology that I just explained have cases of success within the, for example, industrial industry, or all the other fields where you've got a tractor and it gives you with some cameras, they tells you exactly how the grass is growing or how it is. So it does allow you to make decisions on things. And this is technology that is actually there. But on mobility, we're still at a very early stage. This is one of the reasons of MOLIÈRE project going on and being pushed. But for example, the buses of Madrid, of the EMT, which is the municipal transport company Madrid is already using Galileo in their process to allow for this real-time information, to allow for this users data on what works well and what does not work well. So the Madrid municipality is actually making some decisions on bus routes and things like that just because of the use of Galileo. Then this AMB, well, BC, which is bike in Spanish, it's coming. This is not something that is present at the moment, but it will also use this to get the accurate position and timing information, again, to make decisions on how big the fleet needs to be, whether you need any more services, or whether there is some specific location where there are parking issues, for example. So this is one of the potential uses that the use of Galileo can have. And yeah, in summary, basically, you can't have an open, accurate, and reliable geolocation data without it. You really can't have that Wikipedia of open data, which we're going to be using with the blockchain, which is moving data. So if you want this MDM to be trusted, to be useful, to be commercial, and so that everyone can benefit from it as well, you just need to use Galileo. So that is it. If you want to know more from the MOLIÈRE project, you've got the links there. Also from us, from Carnet, helping in this project, in the research, etc. You've got Carnet, and then of course the main beneficiaries of this and the main people who we need to thank them for this is the European Space Agency. So you've got the links in there, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Elena, for your presentation. And yes, this is time for your Q&A, and we already have a question from Jessica. What can that change the job of police officers on the street? Like make it easier for the transportation?
Yeah, first thing that it occurs to me is that, and one of the things that it's actually being used for the autonomous vehicle solution is that there is this service when you have a timely and accurate identification of issues or of an accident, you can actually lead or notify all these police officers or emergency services that something has happened. But also if these national bodies start using this type of services in their own vehicles, for example, the vehicle or the prediction tool can actually let you know about traffic, like real traffic, not just like one user told you 5 minutes ago that there is a traffic jam in this road, no, but like real traffic, so that the route that they can choose, for example, will be the much faster. Perhaps is not the closer one, but it will be the fastest one. So yeah, the moment between interaction, it will allow interaction, of course, it will allow for reliability, it will allow for immediate help if required, and in the exact position. Is not in the street on the corner, but it's like exactly happening here. So I think there are a lot of public and civil uses in there which will benefit everyone. I don't know if that answers your question, Jessica.
Well, thank you, Elena. You really explains a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Jessica, for participating. And I want to encourage anyone else, if there is any other questions for Elena.
Well, if I may, this is Giuseppe from Factual.
Hi, Giuseppe.
Hi, Elena. I mean, I pretty know the answer, but I would like you to elaborate a little bit more because on some of the use cases that we are currently developing within the MOLIÈRE project, where we kind of demonstrate the added value of relying on Galileo source data in more concrete applications. So can you just highlight some example of the kind of use cases that we are developing these days and demonstrating within the project?
Fantastic. Yeah, of course, as I previously briefly went through, this is being tested on mobility as a service, on shared cars, shared vehicles, or the biking public services that are around. The use case that I am more, how you say this, more close with at the moment, because we are closely collaborating with it, is this prediction tool that the Polytechnic University of Catalonia is developing. So what the UPC is actually doing is getting all the data and developing a prediction tool which is able to let you know how buses, and this is for buses, but it will be able to be extrapolated and go, or scalable to any other public service, or to any other service. Actually, when everything is integrated, it will go like, boom, amazing. So it's able to predict what's going to be the route timing, depending on the time of the day, depending on weather, depending on a lot of variables that you can come into the equations. And they are actually developing all these logarithms where the intelligent artificial, sorry, the AI will be able to say, well, actually, this is going to be the quickest route, or don't go. What I was explaining earlier, like go that way or go that other. Perhaps as a user, you want to go to the to route 1 instead of route 2, because you're actually being informed that route 1 will take shorter and it will stop you in one way. But then we also go on to demand responsive transport. This tool will be able to somehow inform what's the best route to follow if you want to serve all these users who are actually taking or wanting to use this demand responsive transport system. So yeah, that's like a super quick brief. I don't know if you want to add something or ask any other questions. Nice. Or if it's been clear, not sure.
No, I think you made a very good summary of this use case. There are a few other that we are developing and demonstrating these days, but I would suggest that, given the fact that we are on schedule and that we move to the, I mean, if there's no any other burning question from the audience, I would suggest that we jump to the last speaker of today's webinar, unless there is any other question.
Okay, thank you, Josep. Thank you, Elena. And as Josep said, we arrived to our last topic on the agenda: user data privacy in blockchain, ensuring GDPR compliance. And our expert, Benjamin Dokier, is going to present it. Benjamin leads the Osborne Clark IP, IT, and data team in Brussels. His expertise encompasses technology law, data privacy, and digital regulation. His practice is a mix of transactional advisory and contentious work for both international and Belgian clients. He's a recognized expert in data protection and digital regulation with hands-on experience in the TMC, life sciences, and financial services industries. His practice covers algorithms and artificial intelligence, data pooling and sharing projects, international data transfers, and other regulatory challenges. Welcome, Benjamin. And when you're ready, you can start sharing with us your presentation.
Thank you, Lucas, for the kind introduction. Let me share indeed my screen. You should be able to see it now. Do you confirm?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for being with us up till now. Because I am the last speaker, I will try to shorten a little bit the presentation to keep it concise and really stress the key message that I want to deliver. So rest assured, it will be about legal stuff, but hopefully not too complex nor too boring either. So ensuring GDPR compliance in the context of blockchain and protecting user data privacy rights, data protection rights, is it possible at all? That's, in a nutshell, the question I would like to discuss briefly with you today. And I will spoil the end of the presentation and already give you the answer. Yes, it is possible. But first of all, I think it's useful to keep in mind the context, the background in which we are asking the question. The background is the MOLIÈRE project and the idea to develop an MDM mobility data marketplace ecosystem where mobility data will be shared essentially through thanks to the intervention of an operator of the central marketplace. And when I say central, it can be decentralized in a technical way. We've discussed that at length earlier today, this morning, I mean, but let's call it a central marketplace for the time being. And it will be accessible to a variety of mobility services provider. It will, and to additional other types of service providers as well. And the user will be at the center of all this data sharing, in the sense that there will be information about individuals using transportation means of all kinds. And that information will be recorded, will be accessible to the various mobility service providers, and will enable also the development of potential commercial offerings. So the question is it how to deal with data privacy and data protection law and regulation in that context? In order to answer that question, one needs to investigate first whether the infamous GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, applies or not to such mobility data. In spite, if in a way, in spite of the fact that blockchain technology is being used for this decentralized database or the making available of the data that is being shared. As I said, the answer is yes, because I said it is possible to comply with GDPR. So the assumption is that GDPR applies to that mobility data. Why is that so? Because GDPR has a very broad scope of application. Its intention is to protect and safeguard privacy and fundamental rights in any, more or less, any types of context in which an individual can be either directly or indirectly identified or can be identifiable thanks to various information about that individual or relating to that individual. So with that definition, you can understand that the intention of the lawmaker is to have a very broad, all-encompassing scope of application for the GDPR. And the specific question in the context of blockchain is, because the data is to some extent encrypted, is to some extent, well, the nominative information about an individual may not be directly visible to the various users of the system. So does GDPR applies in that context as well? And that's what I want to stress and make it clear to everybody that the answer is affirmative. Because GDPR has this very broad scope of application, it does not suffice to say that the name of the individual is not visible or the other personally identifiable information is not visible. It does not suffice to say so or to argue so to conclude that the regulation does not apply. It will still apply. And it will apply as long as there is a possibility for somebody to identify or to re-identify in a way, to trace back the identity of the individuals thanks to the information that is made available and potentially additional information that one has in its possession in another context, for instance. So that means that the regulation, sorry, that means that the regulation applies to our mobility data, but that does not mean that the mobility data, that there would be any kind of prohibition to use or to make accessible that mobility data. It is possible to exploit the mobility data it only needs to be done in taking into account the key principles of the GDPR. And I'm mentioning the key principles in the sense that I want to summarize, but of course one has to comply with all the legal provisions of the GDPR, but it's useful to highlight what the key principles are. They are listed on the slide here, and I don't want to go into each and every one of them in very much great level of detail. I want to maybe stress some of them. One of the key principles is transparency. So users need to be made aware that their information, their mobility data is likely to be used, to be accessed, to be exploited by the operator of the MDM, by the mobility service providers, and potentially also by other types of service providers. When one says that the data is likely to be exploited, to be used, it doesn't mean that it is free to be used by anybody for any type of purpose, because another very important principle of the regulation is that data must always be processed. That's a technical term we use as GDPR lawyers. Data must always be processed in relation to well-identified and precisely determined purposes, and these purposes need to be legitimate. That's also an important requirement. So if the data is being shared for the reason that we want to improve the mobility space in general, and because we believe that sharing the mobility data in the context of this marketplace is a good idea to make it accessible to certain service providers, there will still be a need to refine a bit and to define a bit further what the exact purposes of the use of the data can be, and the mobility service providers and the other service providers will need to respect these purposes and will need to limit themselves in the use of the data to these purposes.
Benjamin, sorry to interrupt. It's Lucas. Can you share the full screen, please? It's going to be better for the recording to present the bottom.
Yes,
right.
I am in presentation mode, so
Okay.
I'm not sure what I should do.
Okay, don't worry then. Don't worry. Continue, please. Sorry for interrupting. You can continue.
You're welcome. I'm sorry if it's not well visible for everybody, but okay, let's continue with the content and the presentation. So I wanted to highlight those key principles of the GDPR. And what I also want to do now is go briefly through the more practical, in a way, implementation of these principles. If one is going to comply with GDPR as an operator of the mobility data marketplace, how should these principles be translated into practice? And that's the scope of the following slides, and I'm going to go through them relatively quickly, but of course, please feel free to ask any question you would like, either while I'm talking or after I have finished my presentation. The first milestone on that journey to GDPR compliance is to carry out an inventory of the data, to map all the data points that that the operator of the MDM has in its possession, has access to, in order to draw a map, in a way, of the personal data that is being used in the context of that system, and to be able to create possibly distinctions between categories of data that are being used for certain purposes, whereas other categories of data are being used for other types of purposes, or maybe sometimes used only for certain sub-purposes in a way. The second very important step will be to define clearly as possible through contractual arrangements the respective roles and responsibilities of the different actors, the different players that come into this scene of an MDM ecosystem. As I briefly mentioned, there is the operator of the MDM itself, but also all the other service providers, including the specific mobility service providers. And under the GDPR, it is important to understand that one can have different roles. One can have some degree of control and decision-making power as to the purposes of the data and also as to the means of the processing, which brings you under a qualification of a data controller. It means that it is the full-fledged application of all the GDPR provisions and obligations to you as the data controller. A data controller could be a company, a corporation. It can also be a group of legal entities acting jointly. So it is also possible to conclude that the ecosystem would be jointly controlled by several actors, several operators, in which case there would be a need to transparently also inform the users that the responsibilities are shared between those different joint controllers. In other situations, the degree of control that one has over the personal data is much lower, is much less. One will then be qualified as a data processor when one operates the data or accesses the data or stores the data on behalf of somebody else who himself is the data controller and defines the purposes for the processing of the data. A data processor under the GDPR has a lot of obligations, but more in terms of ensuring the security of the data, the confidentiality of the data, and let's say the absence of a further processing or a secondary processing for different purposes. So the processor is a little bit has a little bit of fiduciary duty towards the data controller to keep the data safe and to keep the data sheltered from a use for other purposes by other data controllers who would like to reuse the data for other purposes. Those actors, the data controller and processor, must enter into an appropriate contract, which is called a data processing agreement, but I don't want to go too much into those details. What is much more important to highlight at this stage is that the data controller must draft and publish a policy, which is a document that will inform the data subjects, that's the name we give to individuals under the GDPR, inform the data subjects about who is the data controller in the first place, for what purposes is the controller using the data, possibly disclosing the data to third parties, and in what context and for what specific purposes. The data controller is also under a duty to inform individuals in this policy about their rights to themselves have a certain possibility to control the use that is made of their data by requesting information, requesting clarification as to the types of data usage that can be done, the situations in which the data can be shared with the third parties, etc. These data protection policies are really a very important dimension of the GDPR compliance and need to be drafted with care, of course, and especially if the controllers are acting jointly, as I mentioned before, then the policy needs to be decided upon in a joint manner and needs to be published in a joint manner and needs to reflect the fact that the controllers are acting jointly, which doesn't which does not prevent rather the consumer or the user, in case they want to enforce the rights, to act against only one of the joint controllers.
Benjamin, just sorry for interrupting. Can you go full screen, please?
I am full screen.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. For some reason, okay.
I can, if you want, I can try to do something like that. Is it any more visible?
No.
Is it easier to see?
No, it's less visible now. I mean, when I say full screen, I mean presentation mode. I am in presentation mode. Okay. So for some reason, it's not working for me. Anyway, forget it.
I'm sorry about it. I hope it's not making it too complex to follow. But still, I will continue. The next milestones of the GDPR compliance the data controller needs to comply with the data subject right. As I said, there are certain ways for the data subject to control the use that is made of the data, typically to ask access and to ask information about the data that the data controller has and for what purposes it is using the data, etc. What is essential for the data controller is to have certain procedures in place to ensure that any request that is received from an individual is taken care of, is handled in accordance with the timeline that is dictated by the GDPR, which is in short 1 month after sending the request, the individual should receive an answer to that request, although there may be exceptions or specific situations, but that's a general rule, 30 days to answer, to react. And those rights can be pretty far-reaching in certain situations. The individual even has what is called a portability right, which would be the right for a user of a social media typically to have all his account information being ported, being copied and made available for use in the context of another social media operator. This portability right will not always apply in all situations, but I just want to use that case to explain that the data subject right is a very serious topic and can be a topic of concern for data controllers because it can in some ways impair their ability to have a monopoly over the data in a way. In addition to that, the data controller will need to appoint a data protection officer in certain situations. Let's say that the magnitude or the scope or the amount of data that is being controlled by the data controller will be a very important factor to take into account in the decision whether or not a DPO should be appointed. The DPO is a function that must have a very wide degree of independence within the organization and must be able to advise the organization about the implications of the decisions of the board's decision, implications from a data protection standpoint. It is meant a little bit as a compliance function in the financial industry to help an organization make sound decisions that respect the fundamental principles of data protection law. A little bit in the same way as data controllers are, in the sense that data controllers are encouraged to assess the risks and to have an internal function for that purpose. They also have the duty to perform what is called a data protection impact assessment. And that will certainly be the case when geolocation data will be processed and gathered and stored and reused on a great scale, as in the case of the mobility data marketplace. This data protection impact assessment is a methodology essentially to reflect about the technical, organizational, and legal implications of a project, like creating the mobility data marketplace, and assessing how it may be possible to anticipate potential threats or potential non-compliance areas and to remedy those potential non-compliance areas. The next aspect is for companies or organizations to maintain a data register. As I mentioned in the beginning, one needs to create a data inventory. This data inventory needs to be kept up to date. The data will evolve obviously over time, and one needs to ensure that it still remains an accurate reflection, an accurate picture of the global situation within the company. Very importantly, a data controller needs to implement appropriate security measures because they need to ensure the security, the confidentiality, the reliability of the data. So the data needs to be remain fit for the purpose for which it is being used, of course, and one needs to prevent access, unauthorized access by third parties who would potentially change or manipulate the data. This is all part of the technical and organizational measures that companies, data controllers, need to put in place to respect GDPR. There are additional steps or milestones in the journey to GDPR compliance, because I'm conscious of the time that flies. I just want to highlight maybe one thing, which is the data minimization, which is a very important principle in the general data protection regulation. That is to say, in simple terms, that the data controller will always be accountable to demonstrate, will need to be able to demonstrate that it is only using the data that is necessary for the purpose that it is pursuing. So in the context of the mobility data marketplace, it is perfectly understandable that quite massive amounts of data will be necessary, but there is always a necessity or a duty to demonstrate and to be able to explain why exactly that category of data, for instance, is necessary and how it is not possible to do without it. So just to conclude about those various steps to take and the important milestones on the road to GDPR compliance, I hope it's relatively clear or understandable for you. I try not to make it overly complex, and I'm open to take any questions that you would have. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Now is time for your Q&A. And Jessica, you wrote something on the chat. I guess you have a question, more concrete question for Benjamin, please.
Oh, I just wrote something on the board, so that's not my question. Okay. And by the way, I do have one question for Benjamin here, and the question will be, you see, I want to know your opinion about some certain enterprises have their own KYC issues, know your customer for short. And will that be a nice thing as your concern to hold a unanimous criteria to handle all these issues? Or will there be some differentiations to separate maybe geographically, that to make sure that we don't blur our standards to avoid to jeopardize the data protection from your point of view? Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand completely your question. Can you explain and give me maybe a practical example of what you mean?
You see some it's like some at a certain point there will be some exchange who trades the crypto coins and they hold them their KYC issues. Since you talk about the future, and I'm talking about the now situations, so my concern is, will there be some like a red pill, blue pill thing in that jeopardized?
Apologies, but I don't feel.
Sorry, my circumstance a little bit noise, so maybe ignore me. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions for Benjamin? Okay.
I have a question if we have time.
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you, Benjamin, for the presentation. It was very interesting. I'd like to ask very quickly, I know there's no time anymore, and we still have to hear from Joseph. Very quickly, how do you see the EU regulation to impact the blockchain-based systems, and are there any concerns related to that? And which are these concerns, if any? Thank you.
Yes, it's a very broad question, but it's useful because it allows me to highlight the fact that let's say we could think about the GDPR as the first layer or the first floor of the regulation tower in a way, and there will probably be additional regulatory constraints or burdens in specific sectors, like maybe the mobility data space. And to the extent that blockchain would be used in that context, it is, in my opinion, likely that there will be a focus on transparency, much in the same way as there is in the GDPR, transparency and ensuring security. So using blockchain to facilitate data sharing, as such, the goal will not be prevented by European future regulations, in my opinion, or the way I understand it at this stage, but there will be additional duties. So in addition to the GDPR obligations, there will be duties to ensure that the data is shared in compliance with certain restrictions, for instance, in terms of the use or in terms of the confidentiality or in terms of who can access. And there will probably also be additional requirements in terms of the contractual arrangements between all those entities sharing the data, be it using blockchain or another type of technology.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And now Josep Laborda is going to share with us the main takeaways, and he's going to close the event. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for attending. I'm staying until the conclusion of this webinar today. I'm going to recap on some of the most interesting insights that have been shared by our speakers this morning, some sort of conclusions and takeaways for you today. So from our first speaker, from Boyd, we learned that something that we all know, that the user experience for mobility is kind of broken in many cities due to the fragmentation of the offer. There's lots of offer, and there's not yet a consistent and fluid and seamless way of accessing all available mobility services in a city. There's a lot of fragmentation still. That is a huge challenge. We also learned that imposing API standards for mobility service providers generates friction in this ecosystem, which of course does not help in solving this fragmentation. So addressing this fragmentation to make the lives of the end users easier in order to access in a seamless way, in a convenient way, any public, private, or shared mobility can accelerate this much wanted shift towards sustainable mobility in Europe and elsewhere as well. We also learned from Josep Sanjoas from IOMOB, who is leading the technology that we are developing within the MOLIÈRE project, that a decentralized approach to mobility as a service is an interesting way to address the challenges that we're facing. And the way we describe it is as a global and interoperable mobility services marketplace. One particularity is that such a decentralized mass platform, in principle, it is not under the control of any single organization, making it more efficient and in a way also more democratic. We also learned that blockchain technology can be a very effective tool to underpin this decentralized infrastructure by incentivizing all the stakeholders to participate in this ecosystem, in building it, and most importantly, in participating in the governance of such a system. We also heard about one of the approaches that we are pursuing in the MOLIÈRE project to incentivize all participants to be part of such a centralized mass platform by allocating incentives. In other words, by providing tokens to build the necessary critical mass to kickstart such an ecosystem. There was a strong point made by Philip and I would say also some criticism and skepticism on the enterprise blockchains, such as the IBM Hyperledger and others in the market, not gaining eventually enough traction. So there was a strong point made on the fact that permissionless blockchains are much best suited for mobility. Although, of course, in order to make them more pervasive, they need to kind of overcome the challenge that existing legacy systems are, of course, centralized systems and are rather opposed to the vision behind blockchain. So there is a big challenge here in educating the stakeholders in our ecosystem on the benefits of leveraging public blockchains. We need the digital euro. There was a point made by Philip in this regard. We also learned from Elena that Galileo source data for geopositioning that is accurate and is reliable and can be authenticated is a booster to urban mobility. And in the MOLIÈRE project, we are developing a few use cases, as we learned, that make use of geopositioning data provided by Galileo and that prove a benefit of doing so. And by relying on geolocation data provided by Galileo, there are a few applications that will be more resilient, such as mobility as a service, such as demand responsive transit, public transport systems, and also autonomous vehicles that rely a lot on geolocation data that is accurate and that is reliable. And last but not least, we learned from Benjamin on that whenever there is data involved, there are legal issues that need to be taken into account, such as complying with, in Europe, with the GDPR. And whenever the GDPR is involved, something that we need to highlight is that GDPR is there not to prohibit anything in principle, but rather to create a framework allowing for transparency and accountability, which is something much needed when it comes to complex systems such as mobility as a service, and even more when such a system is decentralized. And to finish with my conclusions, so one of the key issues for different stakeholders interacting within a mobility data marketplace like the one that we have built in the MOLIÈRE project is to clearly delimit and define their respective roles and responsibilities and the liabilities. And again, one way to do it is by setting concrete rules and governance and making sure that the GDPR is fully complied with in order to generate a much required trust between all these players, public and private, to enable effective data sharing. That will be my conclusions.